Thank you for joining Hodder and Stoughton and Harrogate International Festivals for this tribute to our beloved author, Peter Robinson. Last year, the crime writing world sadly lost one of its very finest in Peter, author of the best-selling DCI Banks series, as well as acclaimed short stories, poetry, and many other works. Peter was born in Leeds, and much of his fiction was deeply rooted in Yorkshire, where the beauty of the Dales always coexisted with poverty and crime in his fictional town of Eastvale. His novels are a masterclass in plotting and character creation. Alan Banks became so clearly defined and drawn to me that I fully believed it possible that I might meet him in real life at some point, and that I would know him instantly when I did. Peter won many prizes for his work around the world, where his fiction has been translated and published into 20 territories and reached #1 on the bestseller list numerous times. Everyone at Hodder and Stoughton feels his loss, as do Peter's many, many fans across the world. It was an immense honour to work with him, and we cherish our memories of him, as well as the brilliant novels that he leaves us with. Now, in this special online event, 3 leading crime writers, Michael Connelly, Louise and Ian Rankin, will pay tribute to Peter's life and body of work, which spanned over 3 decades, in a conversation shared by journalist Alison Flood.
Hi there, I'm Alison Flood. I'm culture editor at New Scientist, and I also review thrillers for The Observer. I've read and loved many of Peter Robinson's novels. Peter died in October 2022 after a short illness, and we're here today to pay tribute to his life and his writing, which has brought thrills and chills aplenty to readers from around the world. As Joe said, Peter grew up in Yorkshire, and his books, in particular the Inspector Banks series, are suffused with this region he knew so well. He moved to Canada as a young man, later dividing his time between Toronto and Richmond. Beginning with Gallows View in 1987, Peter wrote a book in the Inspector Banks series almost every year. And as well as the beloved Inspector Banks books, Peter also wrote 3 standalone novels, the most recent of which is the #1 bestseller, Before the Poison. His 34 crime novels, which have sold more than 10 million copies, almost all of which are dedicated to his wife, Sheila Halliday, have won numerous awards all over the world and were also made into the major ITV drama series, DCI Banks. I'm told that Peter was always a firm favourite at the Theakston Old Peculier Crime Writing Festival, appearing at the very first festival 20 years ago. Peter's final novel, Standing in the Shadows, is out today. I'm so sorry we won't be getting any more books from Peter, but this is a tour de force, moving between November of 1980, when student Nick discovers he is a person of interest when his ex-girlfriend is murdered, and 2019, when Banks is investigating after an archaeological dig unearths a skeleton, which is most definitely not Roman. It's full of everything you might want from a Peter Robinson novel, expertly plotted, full of music, and a rich sense of place. Me today are 3 of Peter's fellow crime writers. Michael Connelly is the author of 38 novels, including the #1 bestsellers Dark Sacred Night, 2 Kinds of Truth, and The Late Show. His books, which include the Harry Bosch series and the Lincoln Lawyer series, have sold more than 80 million copies worldwide. Connelly is a former newspaper reporter who has won numerous awards for his journalism and his novels. He is the executive producer of Bosch and the creator and host of the podcast Murder Book. He spends his time in California and Florida. Louise is the #1 best-selling author of the Inspector Gamache series, including Still Life, which won the CWA John Creasy Dagger in 2006. Recipient of virtually every existing award for crime fiction, Louise was also granted the Order of Canada in 2014. She lives in a small village south of Montreal. And finally, Ian Rankin is best-selling author of over 30 novels and creator of John Rebus. His books have been translated into 36 languages and have been adapted for radio, the stage, and the screen. He is the recipient of honorary degrees from universities across the UK and received a knighthood in 2022 for his services to literature and charity work. Thank you all so much for being here. I wanted to start by asking you how you first got to know Peter's books. I'm going to kick off with Louise.
I started reading them, of course, long before I started writing and long before I had ever met Peter. I was just, I write crime fiction because I read crime fiction and still do. And, I fell in love with Banks, and dare I admit, and I've already told Sheila this, by association, fell in love with Peter.
How about you, Ian?
I've been wondering about this. It would probably have been BoucherCon Crime Festival, possibly the one in Toronto, which I think was 1992. Certainly it was at some sort of crime function. And we bonded straight away for various reasons. Our first novels were published in the same year, 1987. Our detectives like a drink, and we were both huge fans of music. So we had a lot to talk about, very little of it about the actual craft of crime fiction when we first met.
Did you meet him before you read any of his books then?
No, I'd read a couple. Well, I mean, 87, I wouldn't have met him until 92. So yeah, I'd read 2 or 3, I think, possibly in the American editions, because I can't remember if the American editions were published before the UK or not. I've got a feeling it because the early ones I've got are in the American editions. I bought them when I was in the States for some reason. I can't remember why. But he was, he was an interesting mix of someone who enjoyed life in Canada with his partner Sheila, but was a Yorkshireman to the very tips of his toes, tips of his fingers and his toes. And I'm half Yorkshire. My mum came from actually near where Peter grew up. He grew up in Leeds. He was born in Leeds, and my mum was from Bradford, which is about 10 miles away, as far as I know. So we had that to bond us as well. And it was a thrill getting to know him, an absolute thrill.
How about you, Michael? Did you discover the books first, or did you meet it at some murder convention?
A little bit of both. It's kind of embarrassing, but the before the internet changed a lot of things, we all were really road animals. We'd have a book come out and you'd go on like a 30-day tour, all these cities. And what I found very early, my first book came out in 92, and I was touring by like 93 with my second book. And there's a store in Toronto that was a very important stop off for mystery writers. And what's great about what we do is that we're not competitive, we're all supportive. And so I was at the store thinking, like, who in Canada is going to come see this guy writing about LA? But there was a decent crew there, and among them was Peter Robinson. And so I was embarrassed that this guy would come out and support me. He had read my book, and I had not read any of his books. So that's what started me reading his book. It was kind of like payback for showing up for a nervous evening for me. And of course, Toronto was a place I went to often, and everyone goes with Peter to Feathers, the pub afterwards. And so my memories are, so I started reading his books, and the one that sticks out for me, and I'm not sure when it came out, but it was around this period, was in a dry season. And I just love that book, and probably read something before that, but that one seems to be the one that I think when we got emails about doing this, says be able to talk about your favorite book, and I think that was my favorite book. But
funny you say that was mine as well. Just love
it. I have a feeling we're going to say a lot of the same stuff here. This guy, I mean, what a wonderful writer, but what a wonderful friend. And in my introduction, you say I spent my time between California and Florida. And remember, Peter lived in Toronto. So these are places he liked to go in the winter. So I've had experiences with him in Florida, and in almost an annual thing, he would come to Florida and we would get together. And then, of course, he came to LA quite often for his work. He wrote a book about LA, and I remember helping him with that, helping him get connected with some LAPD people.
Tell us about Feathers then. Is this the pub in Toronto, like his local? This is where you first kind of hung out together then after this book signing?
Yeah, he was always there. God, I remember the place, very smoky place. Sometimes there'd even someone would come in with bagpipes and stuff. But I remember the Bouchercon convention, Ian and Peter and I did an event, an offsite event. I think it was the Toronto Reading Festival. And then we retired to Feathers afterwards. And it was kind of like, these conventions draw a lot of people, and sometimes you want to find a place that no one's going to be able to find you. And I remember we went to Feathers that evening after our event.
So you've all three of you been.
Hang on, can I just break in there? Because this was after Mr. Michael Connelly had killed Inspector Banks and Inspector Rebus on stage. He was the first up to do a reading, and he started reading this piece out in which a bullet, I think, went through Rebus and then hit Banks and killed them both. And then we had to follow that, which was no mean feat. And we did need a drink at the Feathers afterwards, trust me.
So all three of you have been drinking with Peter in the Feathers then?
Well, I haven't. No, I don't actually drink, so I don't have those memories of him, but I have other memories of him that often included Sheila, which was really lovely. Yeah, but you both mentioned about how supportive he was, and that's really, I remember his books, and of course I always will, and I have the collection here, but it's really the man I remember. It's the support that he offered to and continued to offer to emerging crime writers, and including me. I remember the first time I met him was at Bloody Words, which was a crime writing convention in Toronto at the time, and my first book hadn't come out yet, and I saw him across the room, and he was surrounded, just packed in by all these readers and writers who were trying to get his attention, and I'm afraid to say that I was actually too intimidated to even approach him. So I didn't actually meet him until a number of years later. But yeah, no, he was always supportive of me and of other writers. And I'm constantly grateful to him for that.
I find it interesting that you all say how supportive the crime writing community is. I feel like it should be a backstabbing and horrible place to work.
Poets. That's poets, not us. Although he was a poet too, so.
So Ian, do you have a favorite book, or would you concur with Michael and Louise?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Peter wrote so many great books. Anytime that he had a book that featured the music industry or musicians in it, I was always drawn to that. And he did. A Piece of My Heart, I think, is the one that involves a festival from the past and something that happened, and it resonates in the present. So he had a music journalist in that book, and to do the research, he was able to get to visit. It was either Mojo magazine or Q magazine. It was one of the big music magazines in London, and hang out. And of course, he was happy as a pig in dirt, because he just loved all that. And the number of times he told me, he's probably told all of us, the number of times he told me that he saw The Who at Leeds when he was a student, that became the famous Live at Leeds album. I don't know how many times he told me that, and every time he told me, I just had to grit my teeth, because of course I wasn't there. And I would say, well, that's because you're older than me. I mean, when that album was recorded, I wasn't allowed to go to concerts. But there's also Michael mentioned the standalone that was set in Hollywood, No Cure for Love. And No Cure for Love, I remember Peter was very wary of it, or reticent, because it was not part of the series. And he felt that maybe publishers really just wanted, another Banks book that was kind of banker, as it were. But he really wanted to tell that story, and he told it really, really well. And whenever he did step out of the comfort zone that we often find ourselves in, I think he did some of his best work. And the short stories that he wrote, fantastic short stories. As Louisa said, he was also a poet. I mean, he didn't talk that up in interviews, but he had studied literature at university as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate. He'd studied creative writing in Canada between his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in Yorkshire. He was an incredibly learned and literate individual who wore all of that so lightly that I think it tended to pass some people by.
Michael, what is it about In a Dry Season that you like so much?
Well, it's kind of like what he does in the new book. He just he seemed to be a specialist in how the past can kind of like reach up out of the ground and grab you by the ankles. And I know there's been other books, I don't know, before or after or whatever, where they kind of drain the lake and look at the town that had been covered. It's just so fascinating. It's just a great way of getting into the past and uncovering something that is haunting today.
Right.
You see it again in The Shadows, his last book, or Standing in the Shadows. And that was really his, I thought his expertise. It's a bit of time travel, you know, being able to connect what was going on 30, 40 years ago or more with what is happening now. So yeah, they're mysteries, but in my head, I mean, I do it a little bit in some of my books, and I always call them time travel books, because you really got to know, you got to have a foot in both places, and it's got to be firmly planted.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think of him as what among the things he does so well is the atmosphere, the suspense. How you use the word haunting, that comes to mind as well. And the time travel. And the fascinating thing with the Standing in the Shadows is that he moves not only from 1980 to 2019, I believe it is, but he also moves from the first person to the third person. So structurally, you know, he's the thing with, as you know, you've both written more books than I have, but it's very difficult when you write a series not to become formulaic. And he never has. He kept pushing himself and challenging himself. And part of that is leaning heavily on Banks and the character development, so that it never got stale, so that people came back to read the books, I'm convinced, not necessarily because of the brilliance of his plots, but because they really care. They care about the characters. And not every writer can do that.
What do you think makes Banks such a endearing and enduring character? Because he's not a maverick like some protagonists. He's sort of someone that you can really see knowing, I think. What is it about him that makes us love him so much? Michael?
I think his empathy. It's kind of like, I remember we did this once at we were doing something together in Los Angeles, and we said, let me see a show of hands. How many people have solved the murder? Yeah, you know, in the audience, and no one had. And so we write about people who do things that our readers don't know anything really about. And so you really got to try to connect them and make this person who's doing this sometimes dangerous and skilled work real. And like, he did it through Banks's internal thinking, his connection with the world that had nothing to do with being a detective, his music. The music is such a key part of Peter's writing, because it's universal. You know, it's the weirdest thing, because then you read a book, you can't hear the music, but when Banks is enjoying or Banks is interpreting it, you get that. And it's hard to do. It's probably I try to write about jazz in my books, and it's harder than anything else I write, you know, but Peter had the ability to do it. It's so much a part of the books. And I just think, you know, he had these levels of connecting people that had nothing to do with the mystery at hand or you know, the plotting of the story.
Sure. Would you agree with that, Ian? Is that what kind of keeps Banks so alive to his readers?
Yeah, I mean, Peter was a traditionalist, I think, in the best sense of the term. He wrote novels in the English tradition. The detective is a good man in a naughty world. He's unshowy. The detective is unshowy. He just gets on with the job. He's a good boss. He's a very good relationship with those who serve under him. But he's kind of careful, he's cautious, he's detailed, and it's that accumulation of detail that eventually helps us solve the crime. But he's an interesting person to be around, because he is a complex individual. He's got a backstory, he's got relationships, etc., etc. A lot of the violence happens off stage, which again is part of the kind of traditional English whodunit. He leaves a lot to the reader's imagination, which I'm all for. The books did darken considerably, I think, towards the end of the series. I don't know if that's because he was writing them, you know, in uncertain times in history, that there was a lot of political unrest, a lot of things were happening in the world that Peter wasn't happy about. And I think possibly his mood darkened, and along came COVID, and it darkened still further. But the books do get very dark with the emergence of the character Zelda, a trafficked woman. But you know, Banks is just such a, you know, when he goes to the pub all the time. He wants to have his fish and chips, he wants to have his pie and whatever, he wants to have a pint and another pint. Then he goes home, opens a bottle of wine, listens to some music, unwinds. And you think, yeah, I wish I was there with you. I feel like I am there with you. Because you are an empathetic and a sympathetic character. You're a humane character. You're not superhuman.
Right.
You're going to solve this crime through sheer determination and police procedure.
Yeah.
I think he's recognizable and he's relatable. Yeah, good company.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask the three of you, because you've all written very long-running characters as well. What are the tricks to keeping such a long-running character compelling? And do you think that Peter ever got sick of Banks and wanted to sort of kill him off? Louise?
I think the key is the evolution. The character needs to grow and evolve, and that there needs to be a knock-on effect, an echo from the past. That there has to be a sense that this person is a person fully formed and has a past that we've also witnessed and experienced with him, and that it moves forward through his life and through the book. So yeah, I think that's why he will live on after Peter, which I think we all hope will happen with our characters, with what we create.
And did Peter ever express any kind of, enough with another Banks novel? Was he always happy to go back to him because of this kind of?
Not to me, but I think Michael and Ian know him better. If he was going to say something, it'd probably be to one of them.
What do you think, Michael? What's the secret? What was Peter's secret to keeping him going through so many novels?
I don't think he ever was thinking like, I'm tired of Banks. I mean, it's the luckiest thing in the world to be able to have an audience and keep digging deeper into a character. It's like Louise said, it's got to change and evolve from book to book, or there's no sense in doing it. And that happened, his Banks was always evolving, and the relationships were changing and growing. So he never said to me like, I'm tired of doing Banks. He did have the same idea I did, was that the best way to keep this character going is not to write about him 365 days a year, every year, in and out. So he did other stuff every now and then. And when he came to LA to research the LA book, that was part of what he was doing. And we were both doing that at kind of at the same time, or coming to realize that Banks is my man, Harry Bosch is my man, but to keep him going, I got to take a year off every now and then, let that battery recharge, or start to miss that character, so that you come back, with a lot of force next time you write about him.
Oh, sure. How about you, Ian? You've retired Rebus a few times, I know, but he's still coming back and fighting the baddies.
Yeah, I think I've retired him once, maybe twice, and that's it. He's now an old age pensioner. No more police work for him. Yeah, I mean, we did discuss this, Peter and I, often either in the Feathers or in the Oxford Bar, where I drink and where my character Rebus drinks. This notion that how do you keep a long-running series fresh? And it is to do with evolution, as my fellow writers have suggested. It's to do with the fact that the main character is not set in aspic. They're not a museum piece, that they do change, they do evolve. Banks gets more seniority, people around him, things happen to them for better or worse, that changes him. Again, his personal circumstances change, his kids grow up. And as we are aging as readers, we watch the characters that we read about age as well, and they're going through some of the stuff we're going through and vice versa. And I think that keeps the author on their toes, because the characters between books have changed. And especially, as Michael said, if you take a year off between books, so you're only writing a book maybe every couple of years. I'm on a year off just now. It's lovely. I just hope I don't get any ideas during my year off. But yeah, we did, we discussed this a lot. And I think we actually discussed it. Peter and I did a headline event at Theakston's Peculier crime writing festival, and I forget which year it was, and they installed a bar on the stage, and it was set up as though we were actually just sitting in a bar, chewing the fat and chatting away. But they'd also installed a barrel of Theakston's beer, and we could wander up to the bar, pull the pump, and refill our glasses as and when. And we honestly, I think we said afterwards, we honestly forgot there was an audience. Because we were just enjoying chatting away so much about the foibles of our characters and what we took from them. And one of the things that I think Banks did for Peter was keep him connected to Yorkshire. Mm. I mean, his parents were always in Yorkshire. He and Sheila would go and visit them. They eventually got a holiday home in Richmond in North Yorkshire. We went and stayed with them. My wife and I went and stayed with them one time. They started a little book festival in Richmond because he was a local celebrity. But it did connect him to the countryside, the cities and towns that he knew well and he loved. And so all the time that he was living in Toronto, living happily with Sheila in Toronto, he still had that connective tissue to the place that he also loved, which was Yorkshire.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, Michael, the dual timelines of Standing in the Shadows, and it's so expertly woven together, such a glorious finale to it all. Was Peter a plotter of his books, or was he kind of a fly by the seat of his pantser that sort of saw where the story took him? I don't know how much he talked to you guys about that, but Ian, did he say how his books would come together?
You know, it's funny.
Michael, you take that.
No, well, you're going to have to say this because you kind of said this earlier. When we would get together, the last thing we'd talk about is how we write our books. But to tell you the truth, I don't know if he was an outliner or not. I do know this. He was a really big researcher, because when he kind of made me feel bad, because I was a journalist in LA for 10 years before I started writing my book. So I kind of thought I knew everything about the LAPD. And then he comes out to research his books. And he's spending day and night with this unit, that tracks down threats against celebrities and so forth. And it's like he ended up knowing all these people that I don't even know. And it was kind of a reminder that, that's the basis of the book. This people want authenticity in what they're reading, and that's what he was after. Now, how did that go into a plotting situation? Did he outline? Did he do any of that stuff? We never talk about that. It's like, yeah, I've just never been in a lot of conversations with writers who say like, "Hey, do you outline?" or that.
Fair enough.
Or like, what's your favorite beer?
Shortly after Peter died, his widow Sheila did write a piece for a crime magazine, possibly an online magazine. I forget which one it was. And she talked about this. She said that he wasn't. She said he wasn't a great plotter. He did fly by the seat of his pants. But he did think a lot. He thought long and hard about the book before he started putting pen to paper. And he did love doing the research, and he did spend a lot of time doing the research. But when it came to actually structuring the book, she said, no, he just went at it. He just started writing. Now, that seems extraordinary to me because, we've got his new book, Standing in the Shadows. And two timelines, first person, third person, as Louise has said. There are detailed, because the stuff that happened in the past is happening at much the same time as the Yorkshire Ripper is on the go. And in fact, a character in the book becomes a suspect in the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry. So all of that, he's had to go and do the research for which day was something happening, on which particular day were the newspapers covering this or the police were having this press conference. That's all beautifully done. It doesn't feel like reportage. He manages to weave it into the story in such a way that he's doing the research without putting his hands up and saying, hey, look at me, I'm a great researcher.
Right. Or structure. It doesn't feel, it flows so naturally from one timeline to another, and he makes the distinction so clear.
Definitely in the voices as well. You can definitely feel the difference with the first person voice. Plus, also sometimes when you have things like that, you kind of want to stick with one bit and not move to the other section. But I definitely didn't feel like that with this. I was happy to be with Banks or go back to Nick in the 1980s. Was Peter an immediate success as a writer? Louise, you spoke about how supportive he was to you when you were starting out. I don't know what it was like for him when he was first published.
Yeah, honestly, I can't answer that. I don't know. I was a baby at the time.
Ian, you said you were published around the same time as him for the first time.
We were both published about the same time, and our first books fell pretty much dead from the, from the cradle. Not reviewed much. He had more success than me because he's so canny, so canny. He's both British and Canadian, right? So he can win awards in 2 different countries. And the Canadians, revered him from quite early on. The Arthur Ellis Awards. I mean, I don't know, I've lost count of how many times he either won for the novel or he won for short story or he was shortlisted, whatever. So Canada was very good to Peter from quite early on. And when you're not getting great sales, those awards are important to you for all kinds of reasons. Number one, you will pick up readers as a result of being able to put that in front of your book. Number two, it just gives you the confidence. Readers aren't here yet, but they will come. I know what I'm doing and I'm good at it. I keep winning these prizes. Surely the readers will come eventually.
And publishers notice, which is nice. Yeah. The publishers, publishers disappearing completely.
Yeah. So all of that was important for him. I didn't get any of that early on. I just, I had a wife who supported me financially while I was scraping by.
Mm-hmm. What I'm really keen to know, Michael, is how like Banks was Peter himself?
Well, you know what? I think he was a lot in my mind. Like, when you read books, you either create a character in your head or you ascribe it to a movie star or something. I always saw Peter as Banks. And I had this when I was early on in Standing in the Shadows. There's just this, it's a wonderful moment. It's a textbook Peter Robinson move in a book. Banks is just making toast, and it reminds him how his father said you only toast white bread or something like that. And then it goes on to like a little paragraph about his parents in their 90s in a care home up north. And God, I felt so bad because I was thinking like their son is gone now. And so like it was Peter intruding into this book. And I remember just having a very sad moment when I read what was a very well, a little brushstroke of character while the guy's making toast. That's the genius of Peter. But at the same time, I really had one of those like, crap, I can't believe he's gone. Because Banks is gone. I mean, as Louise said, people will be reading about him for decades. But this is the last story.
Would you agree, Louise? Did you see Peter in Banks?
Absolutely. I mean, I do. I can actually make sometimes on my good days a distinction between fact and fiction, but I absolutely saw Banks and Peter as a kind of a meld, and Sheila and I talked about that, and clearly, I didn't know well enough to be able to say where the distinctions are, or the differences are, but he was gentle and thoughtful and kind and smart, and as Ian said, he didn't lord it over anyone. He carried it lightly. He was relatable. Yeah. One of the kindest things he did for me, and I'll never forget this, and it really helped me as I moved through my career, and that was at his book was just coming out about the same time mine was. Mine came out slightly earlier, and he was having a big launch at Poison Pen, a bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, with Barbara Peters. And there was no place for me at Barbara Peters, and that was a big place to launch a book. She was all booked up. We got there too late in terms of trying to fit in an event for me. And Peter said, "Come and join me. You can come on stage." Now, a launch event is important for a book. You don't necessarily want to share that with another author who's also launching a book, but he did, and it was an act of such pure kindness that it showed that he really walked the walk. He didn't just talk about supporting authors. He actually did it.
Super kind. Ian, do you have any thoughts about Banks and Peter's similarities or not?
Yeah, I toured Canada in early November last year, and I had a free day in Toronto, and I spent much of it with Sheila, Peter's widow, and we met at the house. We went for a very long walk. The area they stay in is called the Beaches. It's a kind of waterfront. There's a very long beach or long strand with a walkway, a promenade along it. And we walked and we walked and we walked and we walked and we talked. And she said, I think we stopped for some food at some point, and she said, you know, Peter wasn't Banks. He would say, if he was being interviewed, he would say that he's, you know, he's not, that he's got some of his characteristics, but he isn't Inspector Banks. But he was, you know, he kind of was. I mean, the kind of, you know, the music, the beer, the connection to Yorkshire, just being a good guy, being someone you can rely on, someone you can trust, someone who'll get the job done. You know, I mean, it's what publishers dream of in an author, is someone who just keeps bringing great books to them, and never stops. And he never did stop, and he loved it. And it's interesting that he studied creative writing. I mean, as soon as he finished his undergraduate degree in England, he was determined he was going to be a writer, and off he went. He would have been in his early 20s, I guess, and off he went to Canada to do a creative writing degree. And so he knew what he wanted his career path to be, and he had the chops to do it. He just never gave up on that. And it was just, you know, that day I spent with Sheila was just the most moving part of it was when we went back to the house, and I think I was waiting for a cab, and we're waiting in the hall, and it was just lined with books. It was lined with books that, not that Peter had written, but books that Peter had read. And she said, what am I going to do with these? Because that, you know, books do furnish a room, as the saying goes, and they are the individual's personality. His personality would be wrapped up in the books that he collected and the music he collected. And it just felt, suddenly the world felt a very empty place to me, because he wasn't there to share his passion for reading and listening with us anymore. So it was I don't know. I mean, I was shocked when he died, because I hadn't heard that he was even ill. I thought that Sheila was ill. I didn't know that Peter was ill. And it was just a bolt from the blue. And I was so happy when Hodder, his publisher, suddenly said, oh, there's a book, there is another book. He'd finished it before he went. And so at least I had that to look forward to. But when the book arrived, I was almost in two minds as to whether to read it or not. Because if I didn't read it, then I would always have another Alan Banks book to look forward to.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
But you did read it.
I did, because I was doing this event, and his publisher had said, look, if you get a chance, do read the book. And I read it. I was in Crete last week. I was in Greece, and I took it with me, and I sat in many a bar and many a restaurant in Crete, and spent my time with Inspector Banks very happily.
Okay, well, in 1 second, I'm going to hand over to Louise, who has an announcement to make. But after that, I'm going to read a few reader memories of Peter. And then at the very end, I'm going to come back to you guys and ask you for your favorite memory of Peter. But for now, Louise, do you want to tell us what your announcement is?
Well, Peter, among the many ways that he supported other writers, was that he spent time as the president of the Crime Writers of Canada. And to celebrate him and his contribution to Canadian crime writing, which was very real and very important, the Crime Writers of Canada have decided to honor him by naming the Best Novel Prize after him. So from here on, for the next 5 years, it will be known as the Peter Robinson Award for the Best Crime Novel in Canada.
Oh, how wonderful. And when is the next one going to be given out, or is that not?
I believe it's next year, actually, not this year. I believe it's going to be the next year.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Louise. I'm now going to read some memories of Peter from some of his many fans. So we've got one from a reader in Australia who is unnamed, and they write, I am a devoted reader of Peter's books and own the full collection. In 2008, on our way to Edinburgh, we called in at Leeds. Being a couple of Aussies and not knowing our way about, we ducked into a big building to escape the rain. Turned out to be Leeds Town Hall, and would you believe it, Peter was about to give a talk to the sold-out room of admirers. I couldn't believe it. The so kind organisers found us a couple of seats, and then I got to meet and briefly chat with Peter, bought a book that I already had just so that he could sign it for me. It was one of those meant to be in that place at that time moments, and I was so happy. It's now 2023, and I've just bought Peter's last book here in Australia. I'm torn. I want to read it, but I don't want to end the Peter Robinson story. Vale, my friend, I miss you. Thank you. From Alania in France, Peter lived in the beach neighbourhood in Toronto, and we did as well. Our paths crossed in the Feathers pub. Banks visited the pub when he was in Toronto on a case. When I approached him to chat, he was gracious and friendly. I have read his books from the beginning, and he is missed. From Helen in Toronto, Peter was my TA in my second-year poetry class at York University in the late 1970s. So cool with his long blonde hair and English accent. I will never forget him reciting the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock at the Pilot Tavern in Yorkville. More recently, I loved all of his books. From Douglas in New Jersey, it was August 1996, and Peter was having a signing of his latest Inspector Banks mystery, Innocent Graves, at the Merchant of Menace bookstore in Lower Manhattan. Traffic into New York from New Jersey was, as per usual, a tad busy. I got there just as Peter had finished his signing and was leaving the store. I obviously appeared quite despondent as I asked him if there were still some pre-signed copies, and Peter, being the gentleman he was, came into the bookstore with me and not only signed the copy of Innocent Graves, but inscribed it as follows: "To Doug, better late than never. Cheers, Peter Robinson." He asked me if I knew where the famous White Horse Tavern was, and as it was nearby, we spent an hour or so drinking a couple of real ales and discussing our favourite mystery novels, an experience I have never forgotten. I am very fortunate to have every book written by Peter and all first editions. He will be greatly missed. From Teresa in Australia, I've never been lucky enough to come to Harrogate, but I once got to Richmond and met him and Mark Billingham there. I have a much treasured photo of me standing between the two of them. I have every one of Peter's books, and they helped me through the many lockdowns here in Melbourne during the pandemic as I read them to keep me focused. I look forward to each book coming out. And finally, from Maxine, I used to live a few doors down from his mum. I once asked him at a book signing if Aftermath was based in the adjoining street. He seemed flustered and said they're all fiction and places, but it's clearly the houses at the end of his mum's street. Such a shame he is gone, but he had left a legacy that will outlive him for a good time to come. Those are really lovely. What a kind author as well, to be so involved with his readers in so many different occasions. Mm-hmm. Michael, can I ask you if you have a particular memory of Peter that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I guess I'll just say the last time I was with him, which was last year. I went to a baseball game with him in Tampa, Florida in March. So it was probably pretty cold in Toronto. So I invited him down, and he was because of the Blue Jays, he knew about baseball, and he'd probably come down for any reason because of the weather. But we went to a baseball game and just sat there like old friends, didn't say a whole lot, and just watched the game and talked a little bit. And we never brought up books or anything like that at all. We're just, good friends. I think we saw each other quite a bit in the 90s when we were trying to build our careers, and then it was less and less over the years. And it was almost always social instead of business related when I saw him in the last 20 years. But I'll just remember the last time I was with him.
How about you, Louise?
I was just trying to think about, I think for me, it was not necessarily a specific event, but whenever I would meet him, which was generally at the crime writing conventions or something like that, he would always give me a big hug, and I would hug him back. And that was very precious. That was very important to me. Particularly, I have to say, in the early days when, that sort of acceptance was really important, when I was feeling vulnerable and unsure of myself, to have that acceptance by someone who was so clearly accepted himself. But then it became more than that. Then it became a friendship, and I looked forward to giving him a hug back. So yeah, that warmth.
How about you, Ian?
Michael may have a better memory of this than I do, but there was one night we were all a bunch of writers, I think, were in the kitchen of Peter and Sheila's house in Toronto, and somebody produced a student card, ID card of some kind, and I don't think it was Michael's, I think it was Peter's, And it was Peter with very long hair. And somebody snapped a photograph of the three of us howling with laughter as we looked at this young debonair guy with this long hippie hair, who did not know what life was ahead of him. And I don't know who's got the photo. I've not seen it in years. Michael, do you remember that? You remember that photo?
I kind of remember that, but I don't have it.
No.
But I had long hippie hair, so it wasn't me, it was him.
Amazing. We'll have to get the photo tracked down somehow. Well, it just leaves it to me to say thank you so much to readers for sending in your memories of Peter and his writing. I want to say thank you as well to our three writers, Ian, Michael and Louise, for coming along to talk to us today. And please don't forget to order Standing in the Shadows, which is fantastically good and which is out now via Waterstones or any good bookshop. Thanks, everybody.